It's a great pleasure to welcome today Nicholas Rosellini, the UN Resident Coordinator in China, and Laurence Brahm, who's an international mediation lawyer based in Beijing and Hong Kong and Kathmandu. So I think Nicholas Rosellini is going to go first, and then Laurence Brahm. So Nicholas, thank you.
So you might be interested, why is the United Nations interested in the Belt and Road Initiative? And I'll just give a couple of quotes to start. One is from the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who said there can be no long-term security without development. And the other quote is more recent, is from Antonio Guterres, the current UN Secretary General, who attended the Belt and Road Forum last year in Beijing. And he said that the Belt and Road has the potential to be a boost for global development, that it can help accelerate achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is often known as the SDGs. We see in the more wealthy countries, industrialized countries, developed countries, we see some of the impacts of growing inequalities in terms of fragmentation, in terms of the loss of social cohesion. And we see in the developing world still hundreds of millions of people living in poverty, hundreds of millions of people without proper access to healthcare, etc. And there's still a very important development agenda that needs to be achieved, despite all the successes that we've seen particularly in this part of Asia, in East Asia and Southeast Asia. But despite all that economic success, we still see that in terms of human development, there are enormous gaps all around the world, in fact. And that's why we have this 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But the agenda, of course, costs money. And the estimates that we see are around, in US dollar terms, $5 to $7 trillion a year, which is doable. I mean, these aren't big amounts if you're looking at a global level. And just in Asia Pacific, we're talking about something like $750 billion a year for infrastructure, just for infrastructure, $750 billion additional to meet the kind of minimum infrastructure requirements that are seen needed in the Asia Pacific region. So this is where Belt and Road really comes in, that this can really help fill some of these investment gaps. It has a focus on infrastructure, it has a focus on manufacturing development, and these are all areas that traditional development assistance either doesn't get into or perhaps doesn't invest enough in. So the fact that there is, in a sense, blended finance coming from China, which is public as well as private, which is concessional as well as market, is actually a very good opportunity to see how we can use these investments in a way that can accompany economic rates of return with social rates of return. And this is, again, why the UN is interested in the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of its potential for social good. I think the other reason is the kinds of countries that the Belt and Road is reaching. Of course, there's no common definition of Belt and Road. I mean, sometimes you hear 60 countries, sometimes you hear 70 countries, and I think it's, it changes according to what kind of context you're talking about. But what is clear is that it does include many countries that are fragile or unstable. It covers the Horn of Africa, it covers Central Asia, it covers the Middle East. And these are countries which are high-risk countries. These are countries where attracting investment is very difficult, and are countries which have enormous infrastructure needs. And one can see some of the data. I mean, for example, for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, Western FDI since 2008 has really plunged dramatically and has not recovered. So in a sense, Chinese investment in countries, developing market economies, and not the usual ones which attract a lot of FDI already in Southeast Asia and East Asia, but in new markets which are high risk, Chinese state-backed investment can help de-risk that and can help boost development in those countries. So I think the tie-up there between the kind of work on development that we do in the UN with the Belt and Road investments, I think there is high potential there for some sort of synergy. And in terms of how, what we're interested in doing is promoting these ideas of sustainability with Chinese investors. The idea is that environmental and social sustainability criteria should be included in investments. The ability to invest in fragile states and help deal with some of the root causes of conflict is very important as well. And we are looking at how to exchange ideas on standards and norms, on investments and activities, joint research on various aspects, and in some cases specific projects in Belt and Road countries. So just to wrap up, I mean, I see the Belt and Road as potentially a very powerful accelerator for development in some very difficult country situations, and it can address some of the causes of instability in those kind of countries, and it can address the investment gap that they have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Laurence to stand up at the podium because the cameras are having a bit of difficulty with a rather low angle. So if you don't mind, Laurence, and then when we have the discussion, we'll all be sitting down again. But I think if you could just speak from up there, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I'll just open by saying I've been a member of the FCC since the mid-1980s, and this has always been a beacon of par excellent journalism internationally, and we've had some really great writers come through these halls and drink at the bars. So it's really a pleasure to be back here and to be able to address you today. I'd like to begin by picking up on what Nicholas has talked about, and that is the question of, through investment in infrastructure, preventing conflict and violence through anticipating rather than reacting to it. And in making my comments, I'll start by talking about the Himalayan Consensus, which is working with the UNDP on this. Look at, secondly, the Belt and Road as a concept and try to clarify what I think are a lot of misinterpretations about it. And third, see how we can work with the Belt and Road in doing exactly that, and that's preventing conflict. Himalayan Consensus really began around 2005 when a number of social entrepreneurs doing work on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau and South Asian southern side of the Himalayas started to come together and exchange experiences. And in a nutshell, what came out is there's three key things that we all found were connected. One is the protection, preservation of local culture and heritage as essential in preserving people's identity. Secondly, doing it through a business, because if you do it through aid, it doesn't sustain. So if you're going to do it through a business, we have to have changes in the financial architecture to get capital to people, because most of the time capital is going up to be traded on markets, and it's not getting to communities anymore. And third, recognizing that the environment, which is very often preserved through the philosophy of traditional culture, is not only something to be protected, it's not something to be feared as blocking growth and development, but actually through new innovation, protecting our environment is the next big megatrend for business and for finance. Well, these are the three key principles. Early articulators were people like Nirupana Rao, who was the Foreign Secretary of India, or Lilamani Payadal, who later was the Chief Secretary in Nepal during the 2015 earthquake. And we began to convene as a group. Well, now we started in 2014. 2017, the convening process. It's not just a conference, it's a process. We put forward ideas and we get people to commit to them. And so in the upcoming Himalayan Consensus Summit on March 23rd, 4th, and 5th, commitments from previous years will be basically delivered. There'll be a renewable energy fund, there'll be an insurance policy for earthquake zones. And I think what's really the star commitment was UNDP's response last year to a call that was made by Mahendra Lama, one of India's eminent persons, a respected professor, and Sun Yuxi, who is China's foremost envoy for crisis situations, who has just retired. And Sun Yuxi told us a very interesting story when he was first envoy to Afghanistan. And he said he arrived there was a terrorist event, a road blew up, Chinese workers were killed, and rather than sitting in the office, he went to the site to meet with the warlords and the Taliban. And he said, look, we China don't have anything against you guys, so why did you blow up our road? And the bottom line was, it was economic. You have so many Chinese workers here. Why don't you hire our people? So that's exactly what he did. He simply sent workers back and hired local workers. And then he found that the warlords were guarding the road and protecting it, and it got built pretty quickly. The bottom line here is economic empowerment. And one of the things that's come out of the Himalayan Consensus process is a viewpoint that the common narrative out there that conflict and violence and terror are something connected to religion or clash of cultures and civilizations is not really a complete or correct view. Actually, a lot of the time, crisis, conflict, and terror are related to economic disempowerment and the marginalization of people's identity. And if you have both of those things, you will definitely have conflict and even terror. Added to that is environmental disruption and environmental distortion because of the rapid changes of climate. And in turn, this causes refugee crises and it causes more acute competition for resources like water, which is why we're called Himalayan Consensus, because it's about water, glaciers and water. And so, moving on this, the UNDP stood up and said, we want to pick up on this call by Mahendra Lama and Sun Yuxi for having a conflict and crisis mitigation facility. And we began to figure out how to do this. 2 programs were initiated, the first one in Nepal, and that's dealing with domestic issues. Now, Nepal had gone through a 10-year insurgency. 40% of the Maoist guerrillas were women. They're worried about their community. And now, post-insurgency, many governments, but a lot of things unsolved, it's back to the community. And a lot of the leaders in those communities at the village level are actually those same women insurgents. So programs are being instituted to try and have growing of crops and to be able to create businesses locally. And what will be launched at this coming summit is what we call the Cardamom Campaign for Peace. Cardamom is a tree that has huge environmental resilience. It actually holds soil, and it is the source of masala. And, cardamom for masala tea. So we're going to have a campaign. Let's all get Starbucks and Pacific Coffee to have latte masalas. And you can buy one and you're supporting peace, because ultimately what you're doing is that's going back to the villages. This is the kind of way of thinking we want to promote, integral thinking. Likewise, UNDP China has stood up and has worked with us to establish something called the Silk Road Dialogues, which is building on actually a precedent that has been with the UNDP China since 2005. They've run a program called Silk Road Cities, involving meetings with culture and economic issues in all the cities of the Silk Road. That's from Korea all the way to Africa. And this has been going on for over a decade, and in my opinion, has been a contributing factor to the idea of Belt and Road. And so Silk Road Dialogues will convene and will bring together think tanks from different countries, looking to begin with at the India-China relationship. Because, if you're talking about the Himalayas, you got to have the dragon and the tiger in the room together. And think tanks have the advantage that governments don't have. When governments sit down to deal with a problem, it's usually after the problem has started, when it's already metastasized to a kind of a aggregated situation, and they're scripted. And that's what they have to be. Foreign diplomats have to follow a script. Think tanks can shut the door, have a conversation in a room like this, have even a debate, but try and come up with some constructive ideas and feed them back. And actually, if you notice, during the 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping stated openly there needs to be a role for Chinese think tanks, actually picking up on a process that has existed in Europe and North America for a long time. And it's an opportunity now for Asian think tanks to begin this kind of policy dialogue. So this is what's going to happen in the year ahead through the Silk Road dialogues under UNDP China. Lastly, because I want to leave room for questions, because sometimes the questions are more interesting than the speeches, leave you with a thought and a story. How many people here have seen the movie Zero Dark 30? Okay, so this was about the killing of Osama bin Laden, and it was, if you remember in the movie, it's a Hollywood thriller, there was the bombing of the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad. Well, I don't mean to debunk Hollywood, but that bombing did not occur the way it did in the movie, because I was actually in the site of the explosion, and I came out of there unharmed. But it made me reflect back on what happened. A few minutes after the explosion, they were very efficient, the Pakistani response, and I was invited into the Foreign Secretary's office, who was then Riza Khan, and he said, look, the Americans are here in Afghanistan. They want us to, fight the Taliban. The reality is, one day they will go, just like the British left, just like Alexander the Great left, and we're stuck because we have to continue to deal with the problem. And most of the time, the problem is related to kids who are totally economically disempowered and have no future and no hope, so they join any kind of organization that gives them power and money. And we need to deal with the economics of development first. And so I did a little research, and I wanted to figure out why that bomb took place, because it was the first major bombing since, I guess, about 5 years in Islamabad. And I learned that only a few days before, an American drone had come in from Afghanistan into Pakistani airspace, and it blew up a madras and killed about 80 children. Now, I thought about that. Does this make sense? You've got some kid who's experienced with video games, sitting in some base, maybe in Colorado, virtually managing this thing that drops a bomb, kills 80 people, and you got 80 people, 80 kids dead, and 80 families that are going to hate you. And then I started to do some research. What does it cost to fly one of those things? It's about $350,000 just to put it up in the air and bring it back, not including the missile. It's probably another $80,000, $100,000. We could build 4 schools for that. In Himalayan Consensus, we build a lot of medical clinics. We can build 4 medical clinics. So if you think about it, and you're able to put the effort into economic development, technical training, vocational training for people, and you give kids a future, and you give communities hope, and you give people something to live for rather than something to die for, because no matter where you go in the world, people are much more similar than they are different. Well, then we're going to be able to see something that will be, how can we say, sustainability for peace. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Laurence. It raises a whole load of questions. Basically, I think when we look at Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese infrastructure development, we've heard really 2 kind of crucial potential advantages. One is a straightforward accelerator for economic development, end of poverty, and then related to that, that's a way essentially of preventing conflict, or at least avoiding so much conflict. I think we're probably ready for questions. I want to just very briefly ask you a sort of general question about what China is doing, each of you maybe, and that is, are we not just seeing a situation where China is filling the void left by America. If I think you both mentioned Africa. Clearly, it's also the case in Pakistan that America is kind of pulling back from helping Pakistan as much as it used to, with all kinds of aid, military and non-military aid. It's certainly true of Africa. China has kind of leapt into the void with both, politically with its soft power, but also in terms of economic development. Is that not just a secular trend that is happening and may not have anything to do with anything other than that sort of the rising power of China and the declining power of the U.S., but also the declining interest of the U.S. in the rest of the world? Maybe you could start, Nicholas.
I think, it's important also to remember that China has been assisting other countries since after World War II. And its cooperation programs, particularly in Africa, but also with other parts of the world, date back, many, many years. So it's not that we're starting from zero and China's suddenly providing, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment or assistance. This has been around now for many years. What is true, though, is that part of this is the changing global governance, that China is now the largest trading economy in the world and the second largest economy in the world. In fact, by purchasing power parity, some people say China is already the largest economy in the world. So, clearly that has repercussions for the kind of global governance systems and institutions that were set up after World War II. And we're beginning to see some of those play out in the world, both through existing institutions, like the United Nations. China now is much more active in the United Nations. It's now the third largest assessed contributor to the UN, to run the UN. It's the second largest contributor to peacekeeping operations. And of course, it's set up a lot of funds, multilateral and bilateral funds, to support development around the world. So I think we're seeing within the UN a lot of change. Similarly with the Bretton Woods institutions, as the voting rights are changing quite quickly. And China's also setting up its own institutions like the AIB, which is multi-country, but originally set up by China. The New Development Bank with the BRICS countries. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which at the moment is an initiative, it's not an institution, but it'll probably, over time, there'll be some sort of secretariat for it and so on and so forth. So, this is all part of the shifting global governance, and I think we have to recognize that that's a fact. And I think the greater power of the South, the global South, and particularly when you look at it economically, and it's not just about China, that may be the most obvious example, but also India economy is growing very fast, Indonesia, Brazil, and certainly by, in another decade or so, most of the world's top 10 economies will be from what is now called the global South. So I think you have to put, it's one thing talking about, what's happening in the United States, which is immediate term, short term. It's 4 years or 8 years or whatever. But there's a global picture as well of longer term change in these relations, which I think you have to take into account.
Thanks. You want to say anything, Laurence?
I think I'd like to add some clarification to my understanding of Belt and Road. And actually last night I was downstairs at the bar and I heard two people talking about the Belt and Road, and they said, oh, China's just going to do the same thing we did in Britain. We went in and we colonized and then we got kicked out. And I think this is not what the agenda is. If we look back at China's own experience in the early 90s when Premier Zhurongji was initially vice premier and had to deal with the transition from socialism to market, or more so having to deal with a lot of domestic poverty and the transition of that to some sort of wealth or at least comfort. A key problem was the internal part of the country. because any one of China's landlocked provinces in terms of population size and probably GDP is as big as many Central Asian landlocked countries and African landlocked countries. And the big problem was, if you want that to develop, those locations, you've got to have infrastructure. You have to have rails, you have to have roads, you have to have ports on the coast, and you have to create the situation that allows for investment. I remember as a student back in the early 80s here in Hong Kong, going up to Shenzhen when it was rice paddies and duck farms. I remember that so clearly. There were villages. And nothing would have happened to bring in Hong Kong investment at that time if the central government had not come in a big way with fixed asset investment for infrastructure. Again, roads, ports, in those days, factory buildings, electricity, real basic stuff. So we look at Central Asia, we look at South Asia, we look at Africa. If we don't have those things, there's going to be no development. So China's agenda is actually to share those infrastructure systems and frankly to export its own systems. So of course there's a benefit. It has to export. China has already super overcapacity internally. Is it a similar agenda from the United States? I don't think so. I don't feel that China is ideologically driven. This is not a Marshall Plan. This is not about aid. It's about business. And Chinese companies will not be able to go out and invest and do what Hong Kong companies did in China or Taiwan companies did in Kunshan or in Fujian province if you don't have the infrastructure. So it's, of course, in their advantage. Likewise, many foreign business people say, oh, what is the opportunity in China? We want to get in the China market. And my first response is it's too late. You're either there or you're not there. Don't enter the dragon, to use a Bruce Lee kind of phrase. Chase the dragon. Where China goes, go. Because there's so many things that China can do well, and there's so many things it doesn't do well. And those are opportunities in the elasticity of what it doesn't do. And that was a big part of our recent dialogue in India, is what China does not do well, you guys do. So it's an opportunity for synergy.
Thank you. I mean, I take your point about the supposed lack of similarities between what China is doing and what the West did. But actually, there are some similarities, not just in terms of the infrastructure investment, but also in terms of the resentment that is created in some countries, target countries, whether it's in Africa or Pakistan. You do get that kind of resentment of the investor, just as you had resentment of the US. And I was thinking of, when you were talking about roads and infrastructure, you think of what the Americans did in Thailand during the Vietnam War. They did very similar things. They built the roads, which are now, a very good road network in Thailand, largely at that time thanks to the Americans. They built air bases. They ended up essentially helping the economy through infrastructure because it was their rear base for the Vietnam War. But anyway, let's open it up for questions, and I hope somebody is going to ask the environment question, because if you don't, I will, because we've talked about how this Belt and Road is going to be, for the benefit of the environment as well as for the benefit of economic development. So there is a microphone. Yes, there's a lady there in the middle. If you can get the microphone, thank you. Just say briefly who you are and. Yeah.
I'm Karen Malmström. I've worked in China many years. I'm a longtime resident of Hong Kong. And thinking about this, I do a lot of work in the Himalayas, and I've been to, let's say, Sikkim, and understanding the area there. But there's and Belt and Road to Xinjiang and the whole thing. But, I'm just a couple of things, because I was in Lhasa when the army moved down to India border and dug in for the second time, just after they announced that everything was fine. And there was an armistice, and everything was all, kissy.
Sorry, what year are we talking about?
This was September 2017.
Oh, Doklam, you mean the yeah, okay.
Yeah, near Gangtok, yeah. Right. So, and I texted my friend in Gangtok, and I said, guys, the Chinese, I've seen a column all day long going to the border, and they're digging in. And I just say, you may want to tell somebody that they're coming, because that's one thing. And then, I was really worried because we were there. And we had no idea. And the Army was doing sorties from the airport, and our, flights were canceled and everything. But anyway, that's one thing where, people I talk to are concerned about the way they're going about this, where they're making their investments, where they're digging in. Because in history, they have always been interested in dominating the Himalayan region.
Maybe we can phrase that as a question. I mean,
Yes,
which is
I'm
which
just
is
so
the
interested.
question is are the Chinese serious about conflict resolution when they are
Correct. When
quite
they're
expansionary in fact,
in
despite
militarily,
what is
right?
militarily, yeah.
That's one thing. And then the
Okay.
Belt and the Road. You know, you see them going ports. You know, so Sri Lanka, I go there. You know, you see them building the ports and everything. And to your point, there really is some resentment. How do you think that, you know, working together maybe with the UNDP as a referee or some third party that can be a referee to say keep things in check while these things are being developed, so the neighbors and the other partners aren't going to get freaked out by what the Chinese are doing?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that does fall broadly under the issue. Maybe Laurence can answer the first bit anyway, which is how serious are the Chinese really about conflict resolution? You know, they've talked about the South China Sea and how they're not doing anything, but they are, in fact. They have done it already.
Look at Dulcum and the recent conflict, which is one of the reasons why the India-China relationship is a priority as the Silk Road dialogues move forward in 2018, because we did see a situation of near conflict. Having been on both sides of the Himalayas, I've heard the narrative from India and I've heard the narrative from China, and the narratives are amazingly similar. So I won't judge them, but let's look at what happened. At the last minute, everybody pulled back and cooled it. Why? Because the BRICS bank meeting was going to take place, or the BRICS meeting was going to take place, and of course the new development bank is key. And of course, even though India is technically saying, well, we're not part of the Belt and Road, they're the number 2 investor in the AIIB and the number 2 investor in the New Development Bank, so they are part of the Belt Road. So I'm thinking let's hope that Asian pragmatism overrides populism and nationalism. And in the end of the day, both sides said, let's be pragmatic and talk about trade and investment and finance for the region and cool the issue on the border. This differs very much from what was playing out in parallel in North Korea, where we had the leaders of 2 countries having, name-calling back and forth, and there was no effort to cool it. So this type of thing gives us hope. In that perspective, the role of the UNDP and the role of looking at issues from bottom up is absolutely critical. There's no way we should delude ourselves because there's not going to be conflicts and there's not going to be problems on the Belt and Road. These are highly volatile areas, regardless of whether China invests or anyone invests or nobody invests at all. However, if we can try to work with a neutral, multilateral convening organization like UNDP and try and bring people together in dialogue before it gets to that stage where you have troops moving on borders and, again, diplomats stuck on 2 sides of a table like this, we might be able to avert some crisis and we might be able to ameliorate some conflict. I think that is realistically what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Laurence. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, and actually, there's one issue of resentment which I think we can talk about is the financial issue. So the Pakistanis are often complaining, sure, about the fact that they've basically been saddled with a lot of debt. So this stuff doesn't come free. The same thing happened to Sri Lanka. There was a major financial burden placed on the Sri Lankan exchequer as a result of these projects. Is that an issue?
Yeah, I mean, clearly from there's discussion about the terms and conditions of Chinese investments, but there isn't that much data available to do a proper analysis. And if you look at the broad spectrum, I mean, a lot of these investments can be anything from a full grant through to a normal commercial loan, through to equity. So I think there has to be a lot more in-depth analysis. At the end of the day, these projects are taken on by governments that have to look at the rate of return for their country, that is opening up a new port and the loan you take to do that going to generate enough tax returns to pay it back. And these are commercial or public investment considerations, let's say, which governments need to do for themselves. I think in terms of the broader issues, I think China has gone through several generations of how it's invested overseas. I mean, there were the kind of turnkey, prestigious projects years ago, like building a football stadium or something. More recently, there was heavy investment in natural resources, in the mining and timber, which are pretty contentious industries, regardless if you're Canadian, Swiss, Australian, or Chinese. Companies investing in mining and timber tend to get bad publicity and a lot of resentment because of the way they interact with local communities, the way they pollute the environment, whatever. I think now in Belt and Road, we're looking at different kinds of investments. I mean, we're looking at manufacturing, we're looking at infrastructure, which, at least on paper, should have a positive rate of return. And what we want to see is that rate of return is not just purely economic, but it takes into account social returns and environmental returns. So, but I mean, resentment is still there, and I think China, at the policy level, acknowledges that. I mean, there's much more talk now at the policy level in China about understanding the local environment, about responding to real demands from countries and not being supply-driven. And resentment is always there with infrastructure projects. I think, I mean, the new runway at Heathrow has taken 25 years and they still haven't built it. So, I mean, there are always winners and losers when you're developing large-scale infrastructure. And I think China is now beginning to be more sensitive to that and the awareness that these projects are not just government to government. They involve local governments, they involve local communities, and that all of these interest groups have to be taken into consideration.
Thank you.
Can I add to that a couple of things? Because we talk about the Chinese investing and resentment. But who are the Chinese? This is a really broad term. So you're talking about government-to-government projects. You're talking about state-owned investment entities and state finance. And then you're talking about private companies. And then sometimes you're talking about private individuals. And these are all different. So you have I spent a lot of time working in Africa. Himalayan Consensus has a sister organization, African Consensus. And there's a lot of resentment for Chinese carpetbaggers, individuals who are going and taking local jobs. There is very little resentment toward the infrastructure that's solving roads and making people's lives easier. And there are very different views, and I think people are very clear about segmenting that. I will also say I met many Chinese who spoke fluent Swahili, which was very impressive to me. And when I've attended China-Arab meetings in Qatar with Chinese diplomats, I'm the only one who doesn't speak Arabic. All the diplomats, Chinese diplomats, speak fluent Arabic. So there's actually a lot of effort that's going to sensitizing and a lot of language work. We were at Beijing Foreign Languages University, huge amount of effort in terms of trying to now have a more sensitive approach. And last, on infrastructure. Look at the Tanzania Railway, which was something that went way back. Nicholas was saying infrastructure is not new. We forget that the fight against apartheid succeeded in large part because of China. The Tanzania railway system and the support that was coming through that allowed SWAPO and the ANC to have bases that were actually in Tanzania, the guerrilla bases, allowed for the pressure on the South African regime during those apartheid years. When we, America, finally had sanctions against South Africa, we continued to supply very superior weapons and technology through third parties. However, that railway system is something that's still in the memory of a lot of Africans because it's viewed as something from the Pan-African perspective as the source of what ended up being the end of the apartheid system.
I've actually been on that railway, the Tazara Railway. It was built in the 1960s, I think, when China was actually poorer, well, the average Chinese was poorer than the Africans who were living in the countries where it was built. I disagree with you about whether it was effective in bringing down the South African government, but we won't go there because actually a lot of the copper continued to be shipped through South African ports, but that's another story. Let's have another question. Yeah, I think in the middle on my right, yeah.
Yes, Marguerite Yates. I'm a financial regulation expert.
We can't quite hear you, sorry. Is it on? Yeah.
So I have a question for Laurence. You mentioned India's role and their expertise in development and what they could bring. I wondered if you could elaborate on that and tell us what their policy is, where they're at, and what they can bring to the table.
I think India has had more NGOs probably than any other country doing grassroots, bottom-up work. And there's a lot of sensitization to the whole concepts that we're talking about. In fact, recently I was with the Indian ambassador in Nepal talking about Himalayan consensus, and he said, don't talk to me about this. You know, we had it long before you guys started to talk about it. And he's right. I mean, they've been sensitized to it for a long time. However, now we have a question of how we address certain issues like coal. So we look at China's own rapid economic development, in which 70% relied on coal. And it's damaged about 50% of the water systems of the country. And likewise, India has the same problem. They're coal-based. Their GDP is higher than China's now, but it's a coal-based GDP. Okay. So working on a policy, I was involved in this as senior advisor for about 2 years. Himalayan Consensus worked with the environmental ministry in China. There's a policy called ecological civilization. And now it's a national policy, and it's involving very aggressive approaches at trying to shift China away from fossil fuels to green energy. So by 2030, all new energy sources will be green. 2050, 80% of all energy in China will be green. That'll be mandated. How can India take that and adopt that? Because I think in India, they also are facing the same questions. So these are actually the things that Indian think tanks are asking us, is what is being done? How can we adopt it? Of course, it will be very different because of the nature of their political system. They can't top down something as quickly. But certainly in terms of sensitization at the ground up, in terms of grassroots efforts, in terms of things like mobile banking, mobile phone banking, finance that reaches local communities, they're quite advanced. And we have a lot that we can also learn from them. And so the idea is to, learn from each other, not to try and say one country or one organization has these solutions. I think that's where the UNDP comes in, because as a neutral convening body, they can bring together these voices in, again, a neutral space and try and come up with practical solutions and put the populism and nationalism aside.
Thank you so much. We've probably got time for one more question, and then we're running out of time. Yes, gentleman here, up this end. Thank you. Yeah.
Tony Watson, the Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts. Laying down hard infrastructure like railroads, ports, pipelines, and so on is great. But is any thought being given to the soft barriers to the movement, particularly of people, ideas, and money? I'm thinking visa rules, foreign exchange, and capital controls, and most importantly, controls on things like the internet and press that will actually cause these the hard infrastructure to be used to its optimum. Think about Europe. One of the things that made it such a success is the ability for somebody to pick up, move across countries, and work or live or invest.
So you're not a Brexit supporter. Right. Yeah. Very good question. Thank you. Maybe each of you can answer briefly, and then we'll wrap up.
I think certainly these kind of hard investments need to be looked at in the context of some of the softer investments that are needed, and that's certainly a role where UNDP sees itself working with the partner countries and with China. In fact, the visa thing, I don't know whether you are meaning within China or other countries, but actually Chinese business people are complaining that they can't, how difficult it is to get visas, say, for Ethiopia or whatever. So it is a two-way traffic. So we have a presence in the partner countries, and what we want to do is to some extent be, I don't know what you want to call it, an honest broker, to understand the needs of the partner country, as well as their institutional and policy and regulatory constraints, as well as what the expectations of China are, and try and help match that. Now, this is very ambitious, and I'm not saying it's going to happen in every country all at once, but at least on a pilot basis, we're working with China and with certain partner countries to see if we can facilitate some of these kind of soft investments that you're referring to. On the China side, we are looking at the various entities or whatever that are involved in Belt and Road, and particularly the state and private sector commercial entities, and seeing how to sensitize them more to the local environments they work in. And we've done something called Sustainable Business Abroad, which is admittedly not perfect because it's self-surveyed, but we started asking on an annual basis, doing a survey of several thousand companies that are investing abroad, particularly in Belt and Road countries, I think 5,000 companies, and asking them, about what kind of standards they apply when they invest overseas in terms of environmental standards, social standards, and so on. So it's becoming like it's a database that we've done the baseline, and now we can see year by year, how it's progressing. So we recognize very much the importance of these soft investments, and particularly I think in the partner countries, we're seeing how we can support them in building up their own capacities, absorptive capacities for these kind of investments.
Thanks. Laurence.
In terms of finance, this is a core issue with the Belt and Road. And so will China's currency suddenly become convertible? I don't think so. But step by step, they're going to be doing swap agreements with countries of the Belt Road where there are infrastructure commitments and having direct exchanges of yen currency with that currency. And slowly, just as their own economic reforms were done step by step, widening the bandwidth, we could see then a free direct exchange of yen currency with many of the countries of South Central Asia and Africa without having to exchange money through the Fed and through New York. And then if that occurs consistently and you have enough of a congregation of partners, you could then see the yen, without being suddenly convertible, slowly becoming a second reserve currency for Belt and Road countries. The next question is, what would that reserve currency evolve like in the future? Would it become even like a euro, in which you have, let's just say BRICS countries, or key powerful economies within the Belt and Road in a basket of currencies that is somehow issued as a denomination with the yuan as a major weight? Those are all possibilities. I think it's too early to say, but let's sort of think in the distance that this is where we could be going. In terms of cellular connectivity and technology, this is an area that's not talked about, but is absolutely critical. We're always talking about steel and cement with the Belt and Road, but we're not talking about this one issue. And Sam Petroda, who's on our board, Himalayan Consensus Board, he's the man credited with connecting India. He was the technology advisor to both Rajiv Gandhi and Manmohan Singh. And he's raised with me as we move forward with the Silk Road dialogues. We have to be talking about a cyber Silk Road. I was just in Delhi recently. I can't get WeChat there. There's so many barriers. And when you think that one country is now becoming the largest AI investor in the world, China, and the other country is leading the world on all of the, outsourcing related to finance and internet, we have to break down the barriers. And that, I think, will have to be in our agenda on Silk Road dialogues as we move forward. So,
but doesn't that depend on the politics of China? What about the free flow of information? It seems to me to be all these things depend ultimately, and this is something very dear to the heart of this club and its members, obviously, is the ability to have a completely free flow of the necessary information. It even comes down to environmental issues where China is very reluctant to disclose information about what it's doing on the Tibetan Plateau to all the great rivers of Asia. And this is a problem for all kinds of neighboring countries, not just India, but also Bangladesh. So don't you need a kind of system where somehow China eases up on its fairly ruthless control of how information flows within China?
One of the things I find in China, because I also am American, if I am in China, I can get access to a lot of things information-wise on a daily basis that I can't actually access in my own country. Now, why? That might sound really funny. But I think that the average, we look at WeChat and Weibo, and they're very active. They're often very political. They have their own innuendos, more so than actually Facebook. And you're with Financial Times, so we have to look at the finance of it. And if you look at how capital markets work, if you think about the listing of early internet stocks, it's based on the evaluation of eyeballs. So China, in this perspective, and a lot of people in India have raised this with us, aside from the control of information, it's the control of assets. Why should I give you, because you're another company like Facebook's a first leader in the industry, why should I give you 1.3 billion eyeballs for free? I will keep those eyeballs for me, and I will raise the capital and create WeChat, Weibo, Alibaba, and then I'll buy you. So I think that the information flow will change when those China companies go out and compete and eventually buy into the platforms that we see outside. And I think that's also happening with news media. Finance, look at the money. Don't look at the information.
Yeah. No, the problem is that you can't. It doesn't work the other way around. So you can't. Facebook and Google cannot operate in China. It said you couldn't get WeChat in India.
WeChat's very difficult to get in India. My response from people there is that it's been discouraged. That was the words that they used. And again, it is in everyone's interest as we move forward with interlocking infrastructure, which demands interlocking finance, which does involve interlocking information, that these platforms do break through. And I think that, often if you want to see why something's being blocked, just like, as I said, a lot of crisis and conflict is about economics, follow the money. So ultimately, I think if we can have dialogue and come up with at least get the financial players in the room, maybe we can also unlock the information snacks too.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but there's a really interesting debate going there about, not just connectivity in hard infrastructure, but connectivity in soft infrastructure as well. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. Thank you. Thanks.